By the time a spiritual battle is actually ending, most people are too tired to notice. You've been bracing for so long that vigilance has become your default. And the one state you're least equipped to recognize is the absence of threat. So the war winds down and you keep your guard up over empty ground. Carl Jung saw this pattern again and again. The psyche resolves the crisis, but the personality is still armored for combat. The signs are already here. The question is whether you're still too braced to feel them. In this video, we'll walk through 5 signs that your spiritual battle is genuinely ending. And I'll show you why your own nervous system is the very thing hiding those signs from you in plain sight. If you have been searching for proof and somehow finding none of it, this is for you. Because by the end, you will finally have real language for what has been happening to you in the dark. One warning before we begin, though, because the last sign is the one almost everyone misreads as failure, as evidence that they fell short of the path when it is actually the clearest proof of all that the war has already been won. Sign 1. The enemy begins to lose its face. For a long time, the darkness had an outline, a them, a force, a presence you could point at and resist. And having a clear opponent gave your suffering a strange kind of dignity. Then, almost without your permission, the edges of that enemy start to soften and blur. And the more honestly you look at it, the more it stops feeling like an outside invader. It starts feeling suspiciously familiar instead, like something wearing your own handwriting. Jung had a precise name for what is happening here, and he called it the withdrawal of projection, the slow and uncomfortable process of pulling back the parts of yourself you had cast outward onto the world. For years, that enemy did you an unspoken service because it carried everything about yourself you could not yet bear to hold. Your rage and your hunger and your weakness and your own capacity for the very cruelty you condemned in it. The psyche is endlessly clever this way, and it will hand your hardest material to a face outside you so that you can fight it at a safe distance instead of meeting it in the mirror. Ancient cultures understood this instinct so well that they built entire rituals around it, loading the community's sins onto a single scapegoat and driving it out into the wilderness. Because it has always been easier to banish the darkness than to claim it as your own. When the projection finally begins to come home, you feel the loss of that arrangement before you feel any freedom. A strange grief for the clean war you used to be able to fight. Now that there is no longer anyone out there left to blame, here is the part that catches people completely off guard, though, because this does not feel like a triumphant unmasking where you finally defeat the villain. The opponent simply stops being out there, dissolving back into you, and what looked like an external demon turns out to have been your own disowned shadow asking the entire time to be let back inside. Jung wrote that one does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light but by making the darkness conscious, and that is the unglamorous work you have been doing all along. But if the enemy was really you the whole time, then what happens to the story you built around the act of fighting it? Which brings us to sign 2. The point where your own suffering simply stops being interesting to you. For most of the battle, the identity of being the one going through the dark night of the soul was load-bearing because it organized your days and gave your pain a meaning and even a kind of secret status. You carried the sense that you had been chosen for something difficult and important. Jung described these self-organizing clusters of charged emotion as complexes. And he noticed that a complex behaves almost like a small autonomous personality living inside you, gripping your attention and running your moods without ever asking your consent. A complex forms around an old wound the way a pearl forms around a grain of sand, layering meaning and memory and emotion over the years until the original injury becomes a whole inner world you can disappear into. And the Dark Night complex is a uniquely seductive one to inhabit because suffering that feels sacred is far easier to carry than suffering that feels merely pointless. So the mind secretly upgrades your ordinary pain into a noble quest. You may have noticed how much of your sense of self had been built on being the one who feels everything too deeply. The one marked by a difficulty that other people could not possibly understand. That identity asked a great deal of you. But it gave something back too, a meaning and a role and a reason. Which is exactly why letting it dissolve can feel less like relief and more like a small bereavement you never saw coming. The thing nobody warns you about is how a complex actually dies, because it does not die in a blaze of healing or some final cathartic breakthrough you can announce to your friends. It dies when it merely loses its grip. When the once magnetic story of your own anguish starts to feel a little stale and rehearsed, like a song you used to love that no longer moves anything in you. The sign you are looking for is not peace and it is not joy. It is closer to boredom. The flatness that settles over a drama that used to feel like the very center of the universe. And as that inner drama goes flat, the entire cast of characters who lived inside it begins to behave very strangely indeed. Sign 3. The inner figures lay down their weapons. If you have made it this far, notice that you are already doing the thing, reading yourself for evidence instead of bracing for the next blow, and that turn in your attention matters far more than it seems. The third sign shows up among the inner figures themselves, the accusers and tormentors, and the looming presence that used to crowd every corner of your inner world. Through the worst of it, these figures were relentless, the harsh inner critic narrating your failures, the dread that something was always hunting you, the voice that turned every small mistake into proof of your unworthiness. Jung understood the psyche as genuinely populated, full of semi-independent inner figures and archetypal forces that we meet almost as if they were other people. Which is why your inner conflict felt so much like an actual war against actual enemies. What makes these figures so convincing is that they are not simply bad thoughts you can argue your way out of, but autonomous contents of the psyche with their own energy and their own agenda, which is why sheer willpower never managed to silence them for long. Jung found that the inner tormentor is almost always a guardian in disguise. A part that learned its harsh job in a moment of real pain and took on the cruelty of the world early so that nothing outside you could ever wound you that deeply again. He even developed a practice he called active imagination, where you sit down to face these figures directly and let them speak in their own voice. Because a presence that is finally heard tends to soften, while a presence that is exiled only grows more insistent and grotesque in the dark. The older spiritual traditions said much the same thing in their own language, that what you resist will persist and what you turn toward at last begins to change its shape. And that opens a question almost nobody thinks to ask in the middle of the fight, which is what these figures were really after the whole time if they were never truly your enemies to begin with. As the battle ends, something tender happens to them that is easy to miss if you are still braced for the next assault. Because one ordinary day you realize they have stopped coming after you entirely. The presence that loomed so heavily over you either turns toward you as a kind of companion, a colleague in your own becoming, or it sets down its weapons and walks off the field without bothering to explain itself. Jung called this larger movement individuation, the gradual integration of these split-off parts into a more whole and spacious self. And that is the answer to what they wanted, because they were never trying to destroy you. They were trying to be let back into the house. You feel it as a strange truce settling over a country that has been at war so long it forgot what stillness even sounds like. Yet the most disorienting sign of all has nothing to do with figures or stories, and everything to do with the one thing you feared more than anything else. Now we arrive at the fourth sign, and it unsettles people the most. The one that feels almost eerie the first time you catch it happening, because the thing you feared most simply goes inert. For the entire battle, there was one central terror. The very abyss your whole struggle seemed to orbit around. Whether that was annihilation or abandonment or meaninglessness or losing your mind completely, you fully expected that fear to be conquered through some heroic confrontation, a final boss you would face down with everything you had left in you. Instead, you reach for it one unremarkable afternoon and find that the charge is gone. That the thing which once carried absolute cosmic horror now feels about as threatening as a piece of old furniture. The strangest part is not that the fear has gone missing. It is the puzzle of where all that enormous energy went, because terror built that large does not simply evaporate into thin air. Jung borrowed an ancient idea to describe what really happens. In antiodromia, the tendency of any extreme to eventually turn into its own opposite. The way the deepest part of night already carries the turning toward dawn folded somewhere inside it. Heraclitus, the old Greek thinker who first gave this idea its shape, watched how everything eventually runs into its contrary. How the cold becomes warm and the wet becomes dry, and the day is always slipping toward the night without asking permission. Your terror obeyed that same hidden law, building and building over the years until it finally reached the far edge of itself and had nowhere left to travel except back toward its opposite. The alchemists that Jung studied so closely mapped this exact passage, the blackening they named the nigredo, the stage where everything rots and dissolves in darkness right before it turns. Because the lowest point of the descent is also the secret flaw from which the whole return begins. What you feared was never only a threat to be survived. It was an enormous charge of life force that had been frozen for years into the shape of dread. And as that long freeze finally releases, the very same energy becomes something you can actually live on. What unsettles people most is the nagging suspicion that they are merely numb or in denial and that the fear will come roaring back the instant they let themselves relax. But this experience is genuinely different because you can poke at the old terror, walk right up to it, and find nothing there at all. No electricity and no pull. Only a faint memory of how enormous it used to feel. The energy was never destroyed. It turned the way a fever finally breaks and leaves you weak but unmistakably clear. And once that central fear goes silent, you are left with a question that sounds almost too simple to matter, even though it is the final test of all. Sign 5. Being ordinary without feeling like you failed. This one is the gentlest of them all, and it is the one almost everyone mistakes for failure. Exactly as I promised you back at the start. Throughout the battle, being ordinary felt like a betrayal of the calling. Because if you had been chosen for some great inner transformation, then washing the dishes and making small talk and surviving a forgettable afternoon felt like proof you had abandoned the path. The end of the battle arrives when you can be completely ordinary without that knowing sense that you should be transcending something far grander. In this moment, you can stand in a line, lose an hour to nothing in particular, have a perfectly mundane conversation, and feel no secret guilt that you are squandering your spiritual potential. The reason this one is so hard to trust is that the ego fell in love with the heroism of the struggle, and a part of you would honestly rather keep suffering meaningfully than heal into something this plain and unremarkable. A particular trap waits at the very end of every deep inner journey. And Jung called it inflation. The ego's secret conviction that because it has touched something vast, it is now somehow above the small and human business of ordinary living. The spiritual traditions guarded against this danger with almost suspicious consistency, the Zen teachers reminding their students that even after the Great Awakening, the only work left is to chop the wood and carry the water, the mystics climbing down from the heights to wash bowls and tend gardens like everyone else. Every hero myth in the world ends not in the blazing otherworld, but in the long walk home, carrying the hard-won treasure back into the ordinary village that never knew you had left. The deepest integration tends to look like absolutely nothing from the outside because the sacred has finally stopped needing a special costume to feel real and you can meet your own plain life without that constant ache to escape it into something grander. Jung pointed straight at this when he reminded us that the foundations of personality are laid not in our soaring moments but in the patient endurance of ordinary life. The capacity to be unremarkable and still feel whole anyway is not a step backward at all. It is the surest proof that the long war is finally and genuinely over. Because a self at peace no longer needs a catastrophe to feel real. So, if you have been keeping watch over empty ground, waiting for fireworks to confirm that your long spiritual battle has ended, take this as your permission to lower the guard at last, because the real ending was always going to be soft enough to overlook. The enemy lost its face. Your suffering stopped fascinating you. The inner figures laid down their weapons. Your great fear went inert. And ordinary life became a place you could simply live again. None of it looks anything like victory. And every single piece of it is. If even one of these 5 signs felt like someone had been reading your private notes, share in the comments below which one landed the hardest because the people who find their way to this channel tend to recognize each other across the dark. And before you go, sit honestly with one last question. What would your whole life look like if you finally let yourself believe the battle had already been won?